So Canon has finally released the EOS R1, and Sony has updated the A1 to a version 2, and this leaves the venerable Nikon Z9 with some stiff competition when it comes to the flagship camera market. And that title flagship, it comes with a lot of connotations. I mean, this should really represent each company's best technological achievements, and at the same time, the flagship camera is the outward face that these companies will be judged by. So should a flagship camera be able to handle anything that's thrown at it? I'm Chris Niccolls, this is PetaPixel, and we're going to discuss it. I think I definitely need more fishing rods and maybe another sword, but where am I going to pay for that? I mean, I got my old Nikon FE kit with all my lenses, like sentimentality, first camera ever, the thing that taught me the trade that I benefit from now today. I can't fish with it though, so I think it's time for a visit to KH.com. Sentimental camera kit, your first ever that you never forget? Maybe priceless to me, but KH.com, they definitely know it's got a price, and they can evaluate that perfectly because their experts know all about this old camera gear, the condition, the accessories, all of that stuff, and they will give you a fair price. And so if you're that person who's looking for their first ever camera, or maybe you're the person who sold this camera and years later you regret it deeply and want to buy it again, KH.com is the perfect place. You know that the stuff is going to be checked out fully by their experts, it's going to be in perfect working order, and there's no surprises, and they've got a very generous return policy if you change your mind. So if you're looking to sell or buy used camera gear, we recommend KH.com. They are PetaPixel's official pre-owned camera gear partner. So today we're going to discuss some scenarios that these cameras are going to be facing and really kind of talk about the ins and outs of each platform. And we're kind of going to ditch that whole ranking thing because first off, Jordan hates making all those ranking numbers, a lot of work, but also the benefits of a camera, what it's capable of doing, it's far more nuanced than just 1, 2, and 3. And so really what we're going to discuss today is from my personal experience. I've used all of these cameras. We're not doing like a side-by-side comparison, but I've used them all. I've used them in many situations for sports, wildlife, landscape. And so I really want to share my experience with you guys and discuss where I think these cameras' strengths and weaknesses lie. But let's just do a little quick overview of the cameras that are on the market right now. So first off, let's start with the oldest. It is the Nikon Z9, and it has been around for quite a while now. This is a fantastic camera that comes with a 45 megapixel stack sensor, very fast readout. So fast, in fact, that they left out the mechanical shutter. It's the largest of the bodies, but it's got a great grip, fantastic controls, really nice quality of life improvements like large dials and really easy to handle controls and fantastic balance with large lenses. It also has all the stuff you want in a flagship camera, like dual CF Express Type B slots, Ethernet, and GPS. One thing that does hold it back though, compared to its competition, it only has a 3.69 million .EVF, and that's way lower than the others. I think it's also important to state that the Nikon Z9 is the most affordable of the flagship cameras, and that's further compounded by the fact that there's a Nikon Z8, which has absolutely overshadowed the Z9 in terms of popularity and sales, and that's because the Z8 gives you largely the same shooting experience and capability for an even smaller body and even smaller price. And then that brings us to the long-awaited Canon EOS R1. Everything about this camera screams flagship outwardly. It's got a beautifully designed body, ultra rugged, very customizable, fantastic control layout, easy to use, big grip on there, balances nice lenses, but still a compact size. And the Canon EOS R1 gives a state-of-the-art autofocus, a beautiful 9.44 million .EVF, and all the other stuff you want, Ethernet, GPS, all of this kind of stuff. And yet this is all overshadowed by the fact that it has a very specialized sensor. It's a great sensor, very fast reading, but 24 megapixels really lends itself more to sports action and journalism, but it does come with an incredibly high price tag. And yet it's still not quite as expensive as our last camera, the Sony A1 version 2. Now this is very interesting because the original Sony A1's pushing 4 years old, and so this is the first update that we have had in the flagship mirrorless market. And it's kind of interesting because we're not seeing a lot of innovation. We're seeing a lot of other stuff that we've seen before. For example, the body design is straight out from the Sony A9 III. It's very capable. It's a very compact and rugged body, but we've seen it before. And we've seen the sensor on all the internals before as well because they're borrowed straight from the original Sony A1. We have a stacked 50 megapixel sensor. We've got basically the autofocusing algorithms that we get from the A9 III. And so we're looking at a lot of technology that isn't brand new. It's not innovative, but was it good 4 years ago? Is it still good enough today? We're going to find that out. Okay, so the first topic I want to cover, I guess you could think of it as like landscape or astrophotography. It's those photo situations where autofocusing speed isn't really the factor. It's more how many megapixels am I get to print large or to crop deeply? What kind of dynamic range am I going to get to be able to handle very difficult contrasty light? And what kind of low light performance can I expect at high ISO? Let's address the big elephant in the room, and that really is when it comes to megapixels. You got cameras like the Z9 with 45 megapixels, the Sony A1 II with 50 megapixels, and then the Canon EOS R1 with 24 megapixels. Look, you can get beautiful pictures out of a 24 megapixel camera. You can print fairly large print sizes, but there's no denying that if you have more megapixels, you can go even larger and crop even tighter. There's also this common misconception that if you have a lower megapixel camera, it's going to give you better results in low light situations or even better DR, and that's just not the case. Lower megapixel files have to be magnified more for larger print sizes, so any benefit you'd have in low light performance will be shot when it's also magnified. Higher megapixel cameras nowadays take beautiful photos in low light. If we really want to look at raw DR and how far we can bring up shadows and handle high contrast scenes, the Canon EOS R1, it does do a great job, but that's largely because it's doing some baked-in noise reduction, even into its raw files. It's going to hurt your overall detail. The Nikon Z9, that does get held back a little bit when it comes to DR because it doesn't have a mechanical shutter, and so there is a loss of DR there when shooting only electronic shutter. This is where the Sony A1 II actually does excel, because you have a mechanical shutter option, you can get the most dynamic range, you're not having to worry about that baked-in noise reduction, and on top of that, you are getting 5 extra megapixels. I know if I was heading out the door and I wanted to shoot this kind of photography, I would probably take something like the Z9 or the A1 II. Okay, next let's talk about portrait photography. And I really do personally like to do portraiture, and it's more dynamic than people think. You might be outside, you might be underwater, you might be in a low light venue like a wedding or concert. It can cover many different situations. But I would say that all three of these cameras, they're gonna autofocus on people's eyes beautifully. All three of these companies make dedicated portrait lenses that are very sharp, very high quality, and give you beautiful results. When it comes to megapixels, it's maybe not as critical. I mean, in a lot of cases, you don't even want to have the highest detail results depending, but at the same time, if I had my choice to have lower megapixels or higher megapixels, why not have higher megapixels? I might want to crop, I might want to print larger as well. Now, portraiture is an arena of photography where arguably things like color science are more important than anything else, rendering of skin tones, that kind of stuff. It is very important, but I guess what I really want to get to is, do any of these companies have issues? And I don't think they do. I think all three companies have beautiful rendering of skin tone. It's all highly subjective anyways to what you like better than somebody else, and you can, in post, get all of these to basically look like each other. Long gone are the days where, for example, Sony's color science was absolute garbage. Do I want to use an A7 II for portraiture? Maybe not like I did back then, but you know, I still think I could get them to look nice if I wanted to. So I really think it's not worth arguing that much about anymore, but proceed to do so in our comment section. But you know, there is one area where the technology can make a difference, and that's when it comes to flash sync speeds, especially when you want to shoot outdoors with flash and you're trying to control the ambient light, maybe bring it down to the same or even lower than the actual subject itself. This is where maximum flash sync really comes into play. So the Nikon Z9, let's talk about that first, because it's unique in that it does not have a mechanical shutter whatsoever. It relies solely on the sync speed of its readout on the sensor, and that's going to give you about 1/250th of a second. That's not bad. I mean, that's comparable to most professional mechanical shutters that we found in flagship cameras for many, many years. But other cameras can push a little bit higher. So notably, the Canon EOS R1 is quite interesting. Now, if you decide to use the mechanical shutter on the EOS R1, you're going to be limited to 1/200th of a second, but if you go to electronic shutter, you get 1/320th of a second and even 1/400th of a second if you're using Canon TTL flashes, and this lets you cut a lot of ambient light. Then we can look at the Sony A1 II. So this can go 200th of a second maximum in its electronic shutter mode. Not that impressive, but it has a very advanced mechanical shutter. When you use the mechanical shutter, you can get up to 1/250th of the second with any sort of manual flash. And if you use Sony TTL flashes, you can push that up to 1/400th of a second, thus cutting a lot of ambient light. Regardless, the EOS R1 and the Sony A1 version 2, they can cut more ambient light than the Nikon Z9 can. Okay, so now let's talk about what flagship cameras are famous for, and that's tackling very difficult photography like sports, action, wildlife, hardcore journalism, war photography. I mean, these kind of situations where you need a rugged, durable body that's always reliable, and you need that camera to focus quickly to get the shot. So the Nikon Z9, this is where I feel the camera maybe kind of is showing a bit of its age, maybe some of its lower cost as well. So first thing, Nikon make a big deal about having these really ultra fast burst rates, 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second with a crop, but that is JPEG only. And honestly, I don't know if I've ever shot that fast and found it useful. You may, I certainly don't in my experience. What I do want is a more reasonable burst rate. 20 frames per second is about as fast as I go, and the Nikon Z9, that's exactly where it caps out. In raw photography, 20 frames per second. Otherwise, the camera's ultra reliable, it's very rugged. The autofocus as well does a great job. It's actually improved quite a lot from when the camera was first released. I love the fact that the subject detection can be set to automatic to detect for you. It is very reliable. I love the implementation and ease of using 3D tracking. And so I think for most journalistic situations, I would absolutely trust the Nikon Z9 to get the job done. But then you get the wild card, the Canon EOS R1. I mean, this is exactly what this camera is made for. I think it's probably my favorite of the flagship bodies just for an overall handling situation in those stressful, intense environments. It's the perfect size and weight in my opinion, but I also love the fact that it autofocuses brilliantly. Canon have really made a huge push in their subject detection modes, not just in general. I mean, I decided to shoot some sports like hockey, which is not something that's AI based for Canon, and it actually did a fantastic job. It was very reliable. But if you are shooting things like basketball, volleyball, or soccer, sports that are built into its action preset, it actually does a fantastic job. I don't know if I've seen a better autofocusing camera for those situations. Very easy to use. They've simplified the autofocusing menu. The buffer is insane. This thing will shoot forever, and it is the only camera that can go up to 40 frames per second raw shooting, compressed raw, but still tons of detail without going to a very specialized camera like the A9 III from Sony, which is honestly probably its closest competition. The Sony A1 II is a very interesting camera because this is where it also is kind of showing its age. The fact that they're still using the same internals from the A1. I mean, when it came out, it was state of the art. This camera can shoot 30 frames per second in RAW. That's plenty, but we were kind of hoping at this point it would be in an uncompressed state. It is still in a lossy compressed state to do that. You still do get good image quality, but again, I was kind of hoping for some improvements. As well, the Sony A1 II does finally add a pre-capture mode. Great, but it was a long time coming. I think a lot of people are actually waiting to see that, so at least it is finally here. Fantastic buffer. I mean, the camera will shoot a long time with very fast CF Express Type A cards, and I've always loved Sony's autofocus. Real-time tracking is predictable. It works fantastically. It tracks moving subjects well. I got to shoot it with an NFL game, and I thought it did a really great job. They've also added now an automatic subject detection selection mode, so at least we are seeing some important quality of life improvements when it comes to sports, action, and journalism. And at least we did get a hardware upgrade with the AI processing chip for autofocus performance that we've seen in other cameras like the A9 III or the A7R5, and this does really help with subject detection accuracy. Shooting a professional NFL game was very stressful and very difficult, and yet I felt the camera handled it beautifully. Okay, so for our next category, we're going to talk about video. Let's head over to Jordan now.
Hi, Chris. I don't know why you put me here with all these sharp things I could hurt myself on. There's so many pokies here. Fly fishing stuff I was expecting, but why do you have multiple swords? Anyway, let's talk about video on all of these cameras. And the main thing I want to get across is these are all very reliable video tools. The thermals on them are excellent, and honestly, the autofocus on all three cameras is very reliable. I'd be happy to lean on that even in very demanding situations. So I think the best way to compare these cameras is to look at them in terms of three different recording formats. And let's start with raw video. Now this is going to give you the most flexibility in post. It's going to let you apply different levels of noise reduction to the footage and push the white balance in any direction. And if you're recording raw, then it really is very close between the Canon R1 and Nikon Z9 because they're both capable of recording compressed internal RAW right to the memory card, giving you tons of flexibility, but the Nikon's able to do it at 8K, where the Canon is limited to 6K because that's 24 megapixels. That's as much as you have there. The big loser here is the Sony, because it's not even capable of recording internal RAW, and if you kick out an external signal, you get just over 4K RAW. That makes the RAW recording essentially useless on the Sony.
No, that's not a toy.
Well,
don't touch that. No.
Sorry. Well, I'll tell you what's also not a toy is 4K internal compressed recording, and all of these cameras are capable of doing it with very flexible log profiles on all three models. And this is what I use all the time. I don't find I need the flexibility of raw video, so I'm shooting these modes all the time. And here I would say both Canon and Nikon have a real leg up in that their 4K capture is oversampled up to 60 frames per second. It's going to give you a very detailed image. Now, the Sony is also capable of giving you a very detailed image, but only if you shoot that 8K recording. If you do go to 4K mode, it's actually subsampled. You're going to miss out on some detail. You're going to take a hit to your low light performance. You want to shoot 8K, downsample it in post. So once again, strike against Sony here.
Stop it. It's not. Just stop. You haven't
Sometimes
talked to
it works, sometimes it doesn't. Another mode that I use all the time on a camera is the high resolution recording mode. This is going to give me a lot of flexibility in terms of my framing afterwards. I can still shoot it in log, and here we have a real difference as well, because if I'm shooting on the Nikon Z8, I can shoot that 8K image compressed, shooting the lovely in log profile. Same thing when we jump over to the A1 too. Here we're getting S-Log3 capture of a beautiful full width 8K image on it. And the Canon really struggles here. There's no option for a high resolution compressed recording on it. If you want the most detail, you got to shoot raw, otherwise you're back down to 4K. So you may have noticed a pattern here. The Z8 is capable of all the things that I require from a hybrid camera, and it's really impressive because this is the oldest and least expensive of the three cameras. Sure, it doesn't have a fully articulating screen, but honestly, if you're buying this kind of camera, you're probably not filming yourself that often.
Okay, so for our conclusion, Jordan is now safely back behind the camera where there are less things that can harm him. Do I have to take a fishhook out of you? Okay, so you're going to stay safely behind the camera. That's all you're going to touch? Okay, all right. I feel like we can do this now. So, Nikon Z9. Brilliant camera, easily the best value for the dollar when you consider what it can handle and the lower price. The biggest problem with the Z9 is honestly the Z8. I mean, the fact of the matter is the Z8 can do so much that the Z9 can do, and unless you need the GPS, the Ethernet, or the larger body, there's not much reason to buy it. I mean, even as a stunning video camera, would you rather the Z9 or the Z8, right? Z8, it's smaller, you can put on a gimbal easier. I mean, so this is the main problem with the Z9. And what Nikon really need to do is add an update to this camera. They got to differentiate now from the Z8. I'm sure they know this. The Canon EOS R1, I mean, this is a flagship camera and it is very expensive. There's no doubt about it, but it does feel like there's a lot of innovation here, not only with a fantastic body design, but with autofocus improvements that are substantial and with a very advanced sensor. The thing that's going to keep the R1 down is the fact that it is more specialized for the sports, action, and journalism than it is for things like the landscape and portrait photography. But this also leaves a lot of room for a EOS R1 S maybe, you know, some sort of version that's going to have a higher megapixel sensor. And if that has a lot of the same innovations that we've seen in the R1 body, that is going to be a formidable camera indeed. And then finally, the Sony A1 II. This is a tricky one. This is a sticky situation to be in for Sony. I mean, look, it's amazing that Sony started the whole flagship mirrorless craze with the original A1. Fantastic camera. At the same time, though, people are apathetic to this product because there's no innovation. We're taking an excellent body, yes, and we're taking a sensor and internals, which to their credit were way ahead of their time. And I totally get that apathy, absolutely. But I think we still have to maintain some context here. I mean, look, when I heard that there was going to be an A1 version 2 coming out, I expected Sony, in classic Sony fashion, to really push the technology and go a big leap above the others and kind of, again, set that standard that other people had to catch up to. And that clearly did not happen. But at the same time, imagine if there was never an A1. Imagine if we had the Z9, the EOS R1, and then Sony came out with its first mirrorless flagship, the A1 version 2. Then you'd say, wow, this is actually a great camera. It's got an improved body. It's got higher resolution than the other two. It's fast focusing. It's got decent video. I mean, it'd actually be a very impressive camera. And in that regard, I do still think that the Sony A1 II is probably the most versatile of these three flagship cameras, albeit at a very expensive price, but you are getting very advanced technology. Sony has a fantastic camera, there's no denying it, but it leaves a lot of opportunity now for a new Nikon or a new version of the Canon EOS R1 to really take over. That's always exciting stuff. So, as always, please subscribe to the channel so that we can all be part of that discussion in the future together. Leave your comments below. We'd love to know what you think. Do listen to the podcast. It's on this exact same channel, or you can listen to it on all your favorite podcasting apps. It is indeed, of course, the PetaPixel podcast. We'd love to see you there as well. And lastly, do consider signing up for a membership on PetaPixel.com. Not only do you get ads free, you're also getting a lot of benefits over time. We've got some really cool promotions and extra bonuses for people who are members, but also it helps us keep making the content that we're making, and not just on the YouTube channel, but our writers and our excellent website as well. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you soon with more on PetaPixel.